Can Blender Guy defeat the fearsome shadow catcher? Let's find out.
When doing Product Viz work, it's likely you'll be asked to create images with transparent backgrounds. This is so products can be shown nicely in a nice clean way on websites or e-shops like Amazon, and they integrate nicely into the background. So if I was to change the background here to a different colour, it usually integrates relatively well because the shadow kind of makes it feel like it lives there. So let's take a look at how we would use a shadow catcher in Blender to create this effect. So we have our candle here. This is our product that we're going to use for the demonstration. Okay, it's a very basic scented candle. I just want to show you that in the render settings, I have transparent set here. So if I take that off and go into rendered view, you can see that basically I'm using HDRI to light the scene, and it's kind of like a studio setup. Okay, so as if this candle is in a studio, but we want to switch that off for this purpose. Okay, so let's create our plane that will become our shadow catcher. Okay, so just go mesh, plane. Right, we need to now position the plane. It's quite big, my candle's only small. Okay, so obviously we want the plane to sit just underneath, so I like to look underneath and just move it down just until that disappears, and then I know it's sitting perfectly on top there. Okay, so now we need to set the visibility of this plane to be a shadow catcher, and you do that by going here into this like square object properties, go down to visibility, expand that, and just click the button here, shadow catcher. Okay, and nothing kind of happens in the viewport, but if you go into rendered view, you can see now that the plane disappears. If I look through the camera, the plane's no longer there, but I can now see the shadow, whereas if I take that plane away by hiding the visibility here, the shadow disappears. Okay, so brilliant, we can now render and we get our shadow. So this gives us our image with shadow, but let's say we wanted more control over this shadow. We can actually have this as a separate pass and then use it within compositing. So if we come to the render layers here, we scroll down, there's an option for shadow catcher. Okay, so now when we render, it will render it without the shadow, but then in compositing we'll have a pass which will allow us to add that shadow back in. So let's do that now. Right, so now the image is rendered. Note that you can't see the shadow, it's not automatically done with the shadow, but what we do have now is a shadow catcher pass, and this is kind of what you get. So it's a black and white image, and that can be used in lots of ways, used in VFX for kind of, superimposing objects into other scenes, that kind of thing. For our purposes here, we want to kind of get that shadow back and then have a bit of additional control over it. Okay, so we can do that with an alpha overnode. Just pop that in here. We put the shadow catcher into the factor. And this top one here, we keep it as white, but we just set alpha. Okay, that gives us this, which doesn't really look like anything, but if we get an invert node, pop that in here and hit alpha, now we have this kind of alpha. You can see where the product's going to go and we get the shadow. So now if we add in another alpha overnode and add in the original image, we get our image with the shadow. Now we can control the shadow. So for example, I recently had a client ask that if we could drop the intensity of the shadow. So we could have tried to mess around with the lights and things like that to kind of do that, but it's much easier just to do it here in the compositing. So for example, you just put a color ramp in before here, and now this black stop here on the color ramp becomes the intensity of the shadow. So if I put the value up much higher, now we get a much less intense shadow. So there's much more you can now do with the shadow catcher, given that you've got it here in the compositor, but for our Product Viz use case, we're now able to control the shadows. So if you found this tutorial helpful, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.